by now is conceptualized by Dr. Sangeeta Menon and Dr. Shankar Rajaraman, two profound scholars and teachers with Team CSP. So Kaavyaalaap comes in two forms. One is Kaavyaalaap Vaisistya, where we have poets and scholars who explain about different forms of poetry and all its nuances. And we also have Kaavyaalaap Vaisistya, where different poets come together and share their poetry. So today we have a very interesting topic about Shilpa Kala, and let's see how that goes. So I request Dr. Shankar Rajaraman to introduce the speaker, and Preet to introduce the topic as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Meera, and thank you, Preet. Today's speaker is Arjun Bharadwaj, whom I know since several years, who has been a Prichaka in several Avadhanas. He's a writer and translator with deep interest in classical literature, arts, and philosophy. An engineer by training, he is well versed in Sanskrit, Kannada, English, German, and Greek. Arjun works as a contributing editor of Preksha, an online journal, and is currently studying the comparative aesthetics of classical Greek and Indian arts. He has co-translated many books, authored over 50 research articles, and enjoys composing poems. He also plays the flute. He is a visiting faculty at many universities and education institutions. So with this brief introduction, I request Preet to introduce you to the topic of today's talk.
Thank you so much, sir. First of all, a very warm welcome to one and all. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce the speaker today. And the topic today the talk will be throwing light on the manner in which classical Indian poetry has influenced the creative minds of sculptors across timelines in the geography of Greater India. At times, temple sculptures too have influenced poets from different periods. The presentation will juxtapose the auditory medium of poetry and visual medium of sculpture and demonstrate how both themes from epics and Puranas are depicted in the two media. I'm really excited and looking forward to the lecture. Myself being an archaeologist and going through temple evolution or reading temple evolution, now getting in both my interests of music and poetry and sculpture, I'm really looking forward to today's lecture. Thank you so much, sir. And I would request you to start with today's lecture.
Namaste. Am I audible and visible? Just a moment. I'll share the screen and kindly let me know if it's all right. You're able to see the screen, right? And see me as well and hear me as well? Yeah, sure. We'll start in a moment. Chidananda Kalamvanim Vande Chandrakala Nairmalyata Ratamyena Bimbitam Chittapitishum. Namaste, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank the NIAS, Dr. Sangeeta Menon and Dr. Shankar Rajaram for giving me this opportunity to present some of my understanding of how poetry, which is a literary form, a literary art, translates into stone. Or in other words, how the auditory medium, how creative description in poems translates into sculptures in stone, and vice versa, how different kinds of sculptures that we find in different temples, they inspire different poets. So I thank you all for the opportunity. Thanks to Mr. Preet and Ms. Srimati Meera Kumar for the opportunity as well, and for the kind introduction. You'll be taking care of all the incoming people, right, Preet? I don't have to worry about that. Okay. So the entire presentation is full of excerpts from the Preksha calendar. Preksha is an online journal which we have been running for the last 4 years. On Preksha, in the online journal, we publish articles every day related to Indian literature, Indian poetry, Indian culture, festivals, philosophy, arts, and several different elements related to India. We aim at giving credible material through the online journal. We also publish books. And in addition to that, we publish an yearly calendar where we juxtapose the sculptures belonging to a particular dynasty, such as we have the Hoysala dynasty, the dynasty which built several hundreds of temples in the state of Karnataka. So we pick and choose certain sculptures from there, and we associate it with a poem from one of the Sanskrit literary works. What we are trying to show by doing that is that all the creative minds of the Indians, whether it was through stone or through written literature, it was the same philosophy. It was the same thought process which worked across Greater India for several millennia. So the entire Indian culture was a monolithic whole, and there was no divorce between what we see in literature and what we see in sculptures. So the sculptures that I'm going to show are from different parts of India, belonging to different periods of time. And the poems that we are going to associate with them are also from different periods of time and composed by poets belonging to different parts of India. Like I already mentioned, what we are trying to point out by this is that the same thought, the same kind of ideas, or the same kind of philosophy with which a poet would have worked, it is almost the same by which a sculptor would have worked on his form of art, through his medium of art. So the title Kaavyaalaap was also suggested by Shankar Rajaraman, just as he is a Shlesha Kavi, Shlesha Mahakavi, more or less. There is a pun on the word there. So it at one end, it shows the correlation between Kavya and Shilpa. Also, it talks about the poetic sculpture, the sculpting within a poem, something like that. So there are multiple meanings that the very title Kaavyaalaap can give rise to. So at the outset, I would also like to thank Shatabdani Dr. R. Ganesh, who has been a guiding force for Preksha and in preparation of the Preksha calendar and in picking out verses and sculptures and putting them together. I would also like to thank the entire Preksha team, which includes Shashikiran BN, Hari Ravikumar, Kashyap Nayak, and KBS Ramachandra, Shrisha, who are the trustees, and also Vasuki H.A., one of the Sanskrit Ashtavdanis and also a very good poet, who gave us this initial thought of associating sculptures with classical poetry. And he also initiated the idea of preparing the Preksha calendar. So thanks to all of them. So I'm presenting what is almost a ready material, which is easily available to me. So first of all, let us start off with some of the sculptures from the period of the Badami Chalukyas of the 6th century CE. Before I get in there, I would like to mention that several of the sculptures in India, most of the sculptures rather, most of the representative sculptures, when they are representing a story, they are either inspired by the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Puranas, or the tradition of the Bruhat Katha. So we have several narrative sculptures which depict stories from the Ramayana, different episodes from the Ramayana. We have several sculpture panels which depict stories from the Mahabharata. We have several narrative panels which take inspiration from the Bruhat Katha tradition of storytelling in India. So from the Bruhat Katha tradition, we have the Panchatantra, the Hitopadesha, the Jataka tales, the Katha Sarit Sagara, several derivative works. The Katha Sarit Sagara is almost like a reflection, the Sanskrit reflection of the original Bruhat Katha. So several of the narrative panels in India, in Greater India, has derived inspiration from these poetic works. When I talk about Greater India, I'm also including the sculptures that are found in Cambodia, Indonesia, Thailand, and several such countries, including Sri Lanka. India of the past, the Bruhat Bharata, the Indian subcontinent, which some Westerners call. So, and there are several sculptures which depict some Puranic ideas, or some of them are narrative, some of them are just one independent sculpture, which does not have association with the other ones. So we have some of the sculptures that we see are narrative, as in they are a panel, it's a series of sculptures in a panel which narrates certain episodes chronologically. There are others which just in one sculpture, they capture a certain theme. So we'll be looking at sculptures of the second variety, where one individual sculpture is kind of representing an episode from the Puranas, from the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, or sometimes it could be a very generic one. It could be a beautiful lady or a beautiful guy sculpted in stone. So I'll start off with the Badami Chalukya period. We have the caves were sculpted out by the Badami Chalukyan kings in north of Karnataka. We also have the temples at Aihole and Pattatkal, which were built by them. So here we have a very interesting sculpture. This is a sculpture of a Narasimha, but usually when we think of Narasimha, we think of him as a very Ugra Rupi Devata, a very fierce one who is like tearing apart Hiranyakashipu, the demon. But here he seems to be having a smile on his face. He is smiling and almost laughing. And yet another speciality of this sculpture is that whereas in most depictions of Vishnu or the avatars of Vishnu, we find the Shankha, Chakra, Gada, and Padma in their hands, or sometimes even the sword. Here, instead of having the objects or the weapons, we have the Ayudha Purushas who are depicted in the sculpture. So we have Sudarshana in place of the Chakra, Sudarshana Chakra. We have Panchajanya, the Ayudha Purusha, an anthropomorphic embodiment of the Chakra, Sudarshana, and Panchajanya, the Shankha. Kaumodiki, which is the Gada, and Nandaka, which is the Khadga. We have them in their human forms and not as objects or not as weapons or things. So it's a very curious thing. Why would somebody depict Narasimha as a smiling deity with these Ayudhas replaced by the Ayudha Purushas or the Abhimani Devatas of the Ayudhas? So one might become curious about this. So Dr. Ganesh found a very interesting verse from the Subhashita Ratna Bhandagara, where this smiling face of Narasimha kind of finds some justification in this verse. The verse goes as follows: Chakra Bruhi Vibho Gade Jayahare Kambo Samagnyapaya Bhobho Nandaka Jiva Pannagaripo Kimnata Bhinnomaya Kodaityah Katamo Hiranyakashipus Satyam Bhavadbyashape Ko Nastrena Nakeriti Pravadataha Vishnur Mukham Patu Vaha. So this is the verse. This verse is in the form of a conversation between Narasimha and the four Ayudhas are the four objects that he holds in his hands: the Chakra, the Shankha, the Gada, and the Khadga. See, now because it's a conversation between human beings, they are probably represented in their humanoid forms, in their anthropomorphic equivalents instead of just objects, because it's only humans who can converse with each other. So this is probably an episode from what is called the Sudarshana Garvabhanga. So there's a story in the Puranas according to which the Sudarshana Chakra thinks that it is because of him, because of the Chakra, that Vishnu or Narasimha is getting all the strength and popularity. He forgets the fact that it is because of the sattva of Vishnu that he is able to kill the demons. He thinks that the fame and the name that Vishnu has got is because of him, because of his prowess. So it's something like that, something inspired by that episode, probably, this depiction here. So in the conversation, Narasimha is talking to these objects that he's holding. He's saying, Chakra, oh discus, listen to me. Bruhi Vibho, tell me, O Lord. Gade, talking to his Gada, Jaya Hare, may the Lord be victorious, may Hari be victorious. Kambo, he is talking to the Shankha, Samagnyapaya, please give me your order. They are all like servants of Vishnu, of Mahavishnu, who is also Narasimha. He is asking him to order. Bhobo Nandaka, he is addressing Nandaka, that's word there. Jiva, he is saying, long live the Lord, as though he can bless Narasimha, as though because of the Khadga's blessing, Narasimha will live long. Interesting. Pannagaripo, he is addressing Garuda there, Garuda who is also the Vahana. Kimnatha, what is it, my Lord? Bhinnomaya, I have smashed him, I have torn him apart. Narasimha is saying, Kaha, whom did you kill? Daityaha, a demon. Katamaha, What was he like? Hiranyakashipu, the very one of the greatest of the demons, the most wicked, the most evil of the demons. I have torn him apart. Hiranyakashipu, Satyam Bhavadvyashape, ko nastrena nakairiti pravadatha. Ko, using what weapon did you kill him? So all of these are kind of surprised that without their knowledge, Narasimha has actually torn apart a demon. So they are surprised and ask, what weapon did you use? You have not employed any of us. So he says, Nakairiti Pravadata. I tore him apart using my nails. I did not need any of you. So none of you need to be egoistic, and none of you need to think that it's because of you that I'm getting strength. It's because of me that all of you are getting strength. Vishnur Mukam Patuvaha. The Vishnu or Narasimha who said these words, let his smiling face protect all of us. So the verse ends that way. So there is a very good justification given to the smiling face of Narasimha, a very rare depiction of Narasimha in a smiling face. It's almost nowhere found around India, I think. I can say it with some confidence because I have visited quite a large number of museums and temples around India. I personally have not found many sculptures depicting a smiling Narasimha, a Prasanna Narasimha. In most cases, we find Lakshmi Narasimha and even more popularly, Ugra Narasimha, where he is tearing apart Hiranyakashipu. So this is a very rare depiction, and to that, a very rare verse from the Subhashita Ratnabhandagaram has been mapped on. So all that we are trying to show here is that we're not saying that this very verse inspired this sculpture. We are not saying that, nor are we saying that this very sculpture inspired this verse. There is quite some possibility that they could have derived mutual inspiration. All that we are trying to say is that the thought process, the common Indian thought process in sculpting a certain sculpture and in sculpting a verse, in making a Kaavyaalaap, both of them are from the same roots. It's a monolithic whole, the entire Indian culture. Okay, there is another one again from one of the Badami caves belonging to the 6th century CE. So here we have the Bhu Varahamurti, the Varaha Avatara, which is rescuing Bhudevi from the Pralaya Jala. He is lifting the Bhudevi up. Wherever time permits, I'll go through the verse because the duration of the presentation is quite short. So I'll just point to some interesting aspects related to the sculpture and wherever possible related to the poetry that we have mapped onto. So in this sculpture, it seems to have so happened that the sculptor has ended upon a piece of rock which naturally has striations in it. So this guy has discovered a piece of rock, a wall of rock rather, which has naturally got striations here, like you see at the bottom. So he would have thought, what could be the most apt sculpture that can sculpt here? So he has very intelligently made use of, he has kind of given the striations on the stone some artistic relevance. So he has sculpted the Bhu Varahamurti, in which, according to the story, the Bhudevi, who was in the Patala Loka or was underwater, is lifted up by the Varaha, Vishnu in the boar form. So he has used these striations to depict water as a part of the story. So these, whatever is below the striations is like below water. And then we also see the dimensions, how a sculptor would bring different dimensions. So the foot of the Varahamurti here is at the bottom of the ocean, like you can see here, and his snout is in the skies. So they are trying to bring that infinite nature. They are trying to capture that infinite nature of Varaha in stone, the expanse of Varaha, with a snout in the skies where we have aerial beings floating around in the skies, and below water we have these Nagadevatas. So that's a very intelligent way of bringing the expanse. And also we see here that the Bhudevi has been lifted over and above water. So the water is represented by the striations, like I already mentioned. And she's now really relaxed and she rests with her hand on the shoulders of Varaha. So the poem is saying that it was a play for Varaha to lift up the Bhudevi. So it is like Kanduka Krida for him. So Kanduka, the Bhumi is like a spear. And for him, it was a simple thing, just like playing with a ball. He lifted it up. And his breath, his very breath is giving rise to different winds. Yasya nishvasita marutodhata. The winds, the marut, which is coming out of his breaths, that is coming out of his breathing, that is tossing this ball up and down, tossing the mother earth up and down. And she's also rejoicing in the process because she's in safe hands now. When she was in the Pralayapaya, when she was in the Pralaya waters, in the waters of deluge, even there she was probably being tossed about. But that was by a Rakshasa. But now it's by Vishnu himself, by Varaha himself. And so probably she is kind of relaxed. So these are just some two examples from the Badami Chalukya period. Let me quickly go ahead with the Rashtrakuta period, slightly of a later century, 2 centuries after the Badami Chalukyas. In the 8th century CE, the Rashtrakutas sculpted out, they carved out the Kailasanatha temple and other cave temples in Ellora. Like many of you here in the audience might know, this Kailasanatha temple at Ellora is very special for the fact that it was carved out from top to bottom. It's a monolithic stone. It's one piece of rock, and from one piece of rock, this entire temple complex has been carved out in a very beautiful Dravida style, the Vimana, that is the one which houses the Garbhagruha. This one is called the Vimana. It is in the stepped pyramid. It has the stepped pyramid structure, which is called the Dravida style. So you can imagine the kind of perfection of planning and of execution the ancient Indians had about 1,300 or 1,400 years back. You see, if it's a temple built independently, if you are assembling blocks of stone and building a temple, then you can afford to make mistakes. If you make a mistake with a certain stone, you can probably replace it with another block of stone. But now we are carving it out, you are sculpting out the temple from the face of a mountain, which is made of basalt kind of stone. You have to have that amount of perfection, because even one small error can destroy the entire complex. So they have a very beautiful architectural perfection and aesthetic perfection here in this temple. So there are some sculptures from the Ellora caves. I'll choose only a few probably. Yeah, this is a very rare depiction of Shiva and Parvati's marriage, which we come across in the Rameshwara cave in Ellora. What's it almost represents the theme that is spoken about in Kalidasa's Kumarasambhava, of course inspired by the Puranas, which were probably prior to Kalidasa, or the Puranas were later inspired by Kalidasa. It's hard to give a perfect timeline to the Puranas. So this sculpture potentially is inspired by Kalidasa's Kumarasambhava or the stories which were in the oral tradition present all over India. So Shiva and Parvati are getting married here in the sculpture, and we have Brahma, the four-headed deity, who acts as the Purohita for the marriage. We have Vishnu, who is performing the Kanyadana. And what's curious appearance of Ganesha here. We have Ganesha at the bottom. So in Shiva and Parvati's marriage, Ganesha is kind of participating. So that's again another historical question. When did this concept of Ganesha come in? Although we have the mention of Ganesha, Ganapati, etc. from the Vedic period, when did this elephant-headed Lord, when did he start becoming a part of Shiva's family? When did he start getting identified as a part of Shiva's family? That's something interesting. Or what we can also assume is that Ganesha was created by Parvati in her form of Dakshayani, probably. And then she sacrificed her body, and then she got married again to Shiva, and then Kumara or Subramanya was born. That's another explanation we can give. Or in most popular senses, Ganesha is also thought of as one of the Shiva Ganas, one of the heads of the different people in the Shiva Gana. And another interesting thing about Shiva here is that because he is getting married to Parvati, he has not come there with his Nagabhushan or Sarpabhushana. He is almost clad in the costumes of a bridegroom. So you wouldn't want to scare your bride on the very occasion of the marriage, right? With all the snakes on your body, etc. That's another interesting thing. And we have several other people also in the background. So they are performing pradakshina around the fire, the Agni Sakshi. That's how the Vivaha takes place, the Pani Grahana. So this is exactly Prani Pidana is the word that Kalidasa uses. So it's Pani Grahana, which is happening here. They are holding their hand together, and we'll have to assume that they are going around the Agni in the middle. So apparently it appeared like the day and night, or the sun and the moon going around the Mount Meru. So the fire in the middle is like the Mount Meru, and Shiva and Parvati are like the sun and the moon going around, or the day and the night going around the Mount Meru. So probably here one can imaginatively associate night with the Devi, with Parvati, because she is Shamala, she is dark complexion, and the day with Shiva, because he is supposed to be fair complexioned. And also, according to our Puranic conception, it's the Mount Meru is like at the center of the universe, or at the center of the earth, and the sun and the moon go around it, causing day and night to this Jambudvipa, or to this Brihad Bharata. So that's a very interesting sculpture, again inspired by some poetic, some poetry which was probably in oral circulation, or probably from the Kumara Sambhava of Kalidasa. And this is another very interesting one. Until this point, I think what all of you would have observed is that all the sculptures, at least most of the sculptures that we saw until this point, are dynamic in nature. It's a moment of an episode which is captured like in a photograph. It's not a static one. So there's an activity happening here in the sculpture. And that is a moment of the activity has been captured in sculpture here. Just like a moment in the entire episode would have been captured by an independent verse. Like we see the one that is mapped onto. And this one is also very obviously a moment in Shiva's movement. And we mapped it on to what is famously called Shiva Tandava Stotra. Many of you would have heard this. Jata Kataha Sambrama Brahman Nilimpa Nirjari Vilola Vichi Vallari Virajamana Murdhani Dagad 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 Jwalal Lalata Patta Pavake Kishora Chandra Shekare Ratif Pratikshanam Mama. There is inbuilt rhythm there here, like one can see, and there is both the Uddata and the Sukumara prayogas within the poem. In the first line, we see the takaras and the mahapranas in the first line, which kind of gives the Uddata field, which can be loosely translated as Tandava. Jata Kataha Sambrama Brahman Nilimpa Nirjari. The masculine aspect of that is kind of captured in the first line of the verse. In the second line, we have softer consonants, Vilola Vichi Vallari Virajamana Murdhani, which is kind of the Sukumara counterpart. So in Ardhanarishwara, we know that there is the Uddata and the Sukumara, which in the later tradition they call as Tandava and Lasya. And on the left part of Shiva, or left half of Shiva, we see that there is more feminine thing. It's more graceful. There are more curves on the left part of Shiva's body. On the right part, it's more masculine. And we see that Shiva is in Tribhanga, and his Juta is kind of moving with him dancing. The meaning of the verse is also kind of obvious. It's kind of straightforward. More than the meaning, it's almost the sound itself which makes it attractive. So this can get classified as Gunibhuta Vyangya, as in the sound itself is very special. The sound of the verse is special, and the meaning of the verse takes a kind of a secondary place in this case. The form of poetry is more beautiful than the sense of poetry in this case. It's one of the cases of a Gunibhuta Vyangya. And now here there is another very interesting one, a very rare depiction of Shiva and Parvati playing the game of dice. We hardly find this depiction elsewhere in India. So we have Mahakala and Mahakali, Shiva and Parvati, playing a game of dice. So Dr. Ganesh quickly associated this with quite a famous poem from Bhartrhari's Vairagya Shataka, a very interesting one. the verse tries to interpret the symbology, what this symbolizes, this sculpture symbolizes. That's kind of independently shown by Bhartrhari in this verse. The verse goes as follows. Yatraneke kvachitapi gruhe tatra tishtatyataiko yatrapyekas tadanubhavaha tatra chante na chaikaha ittam chemo rajani divasau dolayan dvavivakshau kalah kalya bhuvana palake kridati prani sharaihi. A very interesting one. So Shiva and Parvati, Mahakala and Mahakali, they are embodiments of time. They are times themselves. They are metaphors for time. And the dice with which they are playing are the sun and the moon, or the day and the night. Rajani Divasau, the two dice which is used to play what in Kannada we call the pagade. That's played on this what looks like a plus sign or like a cross sign, and that's what is believed to have been played by the Pandavas and the Kauravas, because of which the Pandavas lost the kingdom, they lost Draupadi, etc. So they are playing that game. And the dice that is used are Rajani Divasau, the day and night, because they are Kalaswarupas, they are times themselves. And the entire earth is there, the game board. The game board is the entire earth. And the pawns there are the human beings or the different living beings. So time itself is playing a game with the entire earth as its playboard, using living beings as its pawns. So it's kind of philosophically showing that we are all under the control of the divine. We are all subject to this kala, which is something which we cannot perceive, which is over and beyond us, something like that. Yatra neke kvachitapi gruhe tatra tishtatyataiko. Where once there were many in a certain house, there remains only one. That is what Kala does. Kalaya tasmai namaha. Again, a very famous statement from one of the great poets of India. So wherever there were many people, now there is only one. And in a house where there was only one person, there are multiple people. This keeps happening in our own houses, in our own families. With time, people perish. With time, new people are born. And this is all, after all, a leela of the Kala and Mahakali. They are playing there. And we also see that there are several other people. There is one person holding the Trishula of Shiva there, because he wouldn't want to carry it probably. And we probably have this lady called Vijaya, popularly known to be the Sakhi of Parvati. She's holding up the braid of Parvati there. And one of the Shiva Ganas is even watching over the game, and somebody is fanning the couple. A very interesting and a rare depiction, which we find the Rameshwara cave apparently in Ellora. Okay, so that's one story. And now here we have another very interesting depiction. Usually it is hard to bring out hasya or humor in a static image, unless you caricature something. To bring out humor, you need to have some dynamism. You'll have to narrate a joke where you are telling something with respect to time. You are dynamically showing something, or you'll have to imitate someone, or you'll have to caricature an emotion to make it humorous. So it's usually slightly difficult to capture hasya or humor in stone in a sculpture. But here it so happens that in the sculpture, which again belongs to the Rameshwara cave in Ellora, the poet seems to have managed to bring some kind of hasya and some amount of karuna rasa. Again, it depends on from what perspective we are looking at it. So here in this depiction, we'll have to assume that Shiva is away. Shiva, who is the lord of Nandi, he's away. And this little Nandi, who is also in many of the Puranic stories, he is like the leader of the Shiva Ganas. So whenever Shiva is there, Nandi is, I think, kind of trying to discipline all the Shiva Ganas and trying to give them order, and he tries to bring them under control, etc. So we also get to know from the Kumara Sambhava, where just by keeping his finger on the mouth, all the Ganas become silent. They become arrested. So one finger movement of Nandi is very powerful, and the Ganas have to be obedient. But now their leader's lord, Shiva, is away on a certain day, and these Ganas probably want to take revenge on Nandi. See, all that they are doing, there's one of the Ganas who is biting upon Nandi's tail there. And another one has climbed up the hood of climbed up the hump on the back of Nandi. And there is another Gana which is trying to beat up Nandi. There's yet another one which is kind of swinging on that loose flap of skin, sasna, which as it is called in Sanskrit. It's swinging upon there. And there are other ones which are kind of taunting and teasing and troubling Nandi. Some of them are probably performing a somersault across the body of Nandi. And Nandi is like, he is kind of helpless. He doesn't know what to do. So at that moment, we'll have to assume that Shiva has entered in that place. And what happens next is depicted, is represented here in the poem. Shiva comes there and he tries to save Nandi from the trouble he is undergoing because of the Shivaganas, which have become unruly now, because their leader's lord is away somewhere. Now he has come back, Shiva has come back, and he is saying the following: Shrungam Brungin Vimuncha. Brungi, you please give away the Shrunga, the thorns, the horns rather, of Nandi. Shrungam Brungin Vimuncha. Tyaja Gajavadanatvam cha Langula Moolam. Gajavadana is probably another one of the Shivaganas. Please give up his the tip of his tail, the tail end. See, that's very close to what we see in the sculpture. What the poem is saying is very close to what we see. We actually see somebody holding on the Shrunga, that is the horns of Nandi. We also see that there is another Shivagana which is biting the tail of Nandi. So Gajavadana Tvamcha Langula Moolam. Mandanandosi Nandin. So Shiva is also kind of perturbed. He sees that Nandi, who is like the embodiment of Ananda, he seems to be in the Mandanandosi. You seem to have become really dull. You appear to be really helpless. Mandanandosi Nandin. Alam Abala Mahakala Kantagrahena. Mahakala is one of the other Shivaganas, the name of one of the people of the Shivagana. Kantagrahena Alam. Stop holding on to the neck of Nandi. Ityuktva Niyamanaha Sukayatu Vrishabha Parvati Padamule Pashyan Akshayir Vilaksham Valita Galachalat Kambalam Triambakam Vaha. So Nandi is escorted to the feet of the mother Parvati. So now if he is at the feet of the mother Parvati, then probably these Shivaganas will stop troubling him. So he slowly goes there, and all this ornamentation on the body of Nandi, that has also kind of gone haywire. It's become really haphazard. And here, this lady who is depicted here can probably be Parvati, the one there, or there is another lady who is depicted here. If we have to say that this sculpture actually represents this poem, then we can also interpret this lady here, one of these ladies, as Parvati. So, from the perspective of the Shivaganas, there is some kind of hasya coming in there. And from the perspective of Nandi, there is some kind of karuna, some kind of shoka, which is being represented, some pain of Nandi. Okay. So that's from the Rashtrakuta period. So like I already mentioned, these are excerpts from the Preksha calendar. For each of the 12 months, we have a sculpture and an associated poem. And in many cases, the sculpture goes well with at least one of the major festivals which is celebrated in that particular month. For example, this Mahanata of this was mapped onto what is called the dance day. So it comes usually in June, and we had the sculpture for the month of June. Similarly, this Shiva and Parvati marriage was probably in the beginning of April, sometime during the Vasanta, etc. So there is some kind of correspondence between the kind of festivals that are celebrated in a certain month and the sculpture and poem that we give with the calendar. So that was for, so we have 12 sculptures and 12 poems. I just showed a few so far. Now, moving ahead, slightly of a later period, we have the Pallavas between the 6th and the 9th century of the Common Era. They built several temples in Mahabalipuram, in Kanchipuram, etc. This Kailasanatha temple, which has the same name as what we saw in Ellora. That is also a Kailasanatha temple, which was built by the Rashtrakutas. This one is the Kailasanatha temple built by the Pallavas in Kanchipuram, in Kanchi today in India, in Tamil Nadu. So it's it is the oldest monument in Kanchipuram. Okay. This one, however, this sculpture is from Mahabalipuram, which is also another site where where Pallavas have built several independent temples and also some cave temples of the Pallava period are present there. So this sculpture is a part of the Govardhana panel, where Krishna is lifting up a mountain, and when Krishna has lifted up the mountain, the Govardhana, the entire world below the mountain is peaceful because Krishna has lifted it up. So this is one part of the panel, and to the left of this, to the left side of this sculpture comes. So what's interesting about this sculpture panel is that Krishna is lifting up something. There is no exclusive Govardhana mountain which is sculpted there. So what he is lifting appears to be the roof of the cave in which this sculpture is sculpted. So it is kind of suggesting that it is this very mountain that Krishna is lifting, where the sculpture is sculpted. So it's a very interesting, very intelligent way in which the sculpture is made. So the mountain in which the sculpture is housed is itself the Govardhana, which Krishna is lifting. So that is what the sculptor has tried to do there. So when Krishna has lifted the Govardhana mountain, every other activity, the usual activities of the humans, of the people of the Gokula, it takes place as usual. So that's what we see here. So we see that there's a person who is milking a cow, and the cow is licking upon its calf, and there's another lady who has a few pails of milk or curd or whatever she is probably going around to sell. She also has a basket on the top of her head. This is again one of the rare depictions of everyday life. So the presence of everyday life in the sculptures, in temple sculptures, is an interesting study in itself. We find in the Delhi Museum, in the Mathura Museum, etc., throughout India, we find several sculptures which throw light on the costumes, the activities, and the mannerisms, the customs followed by everyday man, common man, the domestic life, etc. This is one of such examples where the everyday life of the people of Pallava period is kind of depicted. So the poem goes as follows. It's from the Shishupalavada, Maga Shishupalavada of about 7th or 8th century. Pritya Nyuktan Lihati Stanantayan Nigruhya Parim Ubhayena Jananoho Vardishnu Dhara Dhvanirohini Payas Chiram Nidadyav Duhatasa Goduha. So Krishna intently observed the cowherds who were clutching a pail between their legs. That's exactly how a cowherd guy would milk the cow. He would keep the pail, which has to collect the milk, between his knees, between his thighs, and then he would milk the cow. And we humans even cheat the animals. The cow would have gotten the impression that it is giving the milk to the calf, but then while it is licking the calf, we are trying to take away the milk. So the poem also says that as the mother cow affectionately licks upon its calf, the man is trying to milk it, and the pail is getting filled by the milk that gushes forth. So this is a very interesting depiction. And then we have the other part of the panel, of the Govardhana panel. It's a very interesting poem. I'll let everyone read it by yourself, because the video will be shared later on. And this is, by the way, of this year's calendar, 2021 calendar. We have the Pallava period depicted. So anybody who wants to procure a copy of the calendar, I'm left with a few copies. You can ask me. We are already 2 months into 2021. And if you still would like to have a copy of the calendar, we have a few with us. This one is a huge panel from the Mahabalipuram. We have Arjuna, who is like emancipated, and he is performing tapas. He's standing on one foot with his hands raised up. He is praying to Shiva. He is performing tapas to Shiva, seeking the Pashupatastra, seeking one of the greatest of the arrows from Shiva, Pashupati. The poet gives a very interesting interpretation for this, how this moment of the episode, how it looks. He says the following. It's from Champu Bharata. tat tadrushena tapasa tarunendu maulim tanvan daya paravasham tanayo magonaha padagrameva dharano pranidaya tastau udyamya bahum upariva phalani lipsuhu. So with his one foot planted, rooted on the earth, he had raised both of his hands up in tapas, and it looked like he had raised his hands up as though to fetch the fruits of the tapas. Like we would stretch our hands up from a tree when we want to pluck fruits from it. So the tapas itself is like a tree. To pluck the fruits of the tapas, Arjuna seems to have raised his hands up. So that's a very interesting imagery. So the abstract concept of tapas, he has kind of concretized it. The fruitification of the tapas is also kind of suggested here by the plucking of the flowers by Arjuna's raised hands. Okay, this is another very interesting one. So this is where Narasimha is killing Hiranyakashipu. But the poem which it has been mapped onto is even more interesting. So this is a conversation between Hiranyakashipu and his men, his servants. So he's sitting one fine evening, or one fine afternoon rather, one fine afternoon in his palace. So there are his servants who come and report something to him. And this is a conversation between Hiranyakashipu and his servants. The verse goes as follows. Kim kim simhas tatah kim narasadrusha vapur deva chitram gruhito naivam tatkotra jiva drutam upanayatam nanvayam prapta eva chapam chapam nakadgam tvarita taramaho karkashatvam nakanam ittam daityadi rajam nija naka kulishair jagnivan yassavo vyat. So it's a very interesting thing, a very dynamic episode is depicted in one verse in the form of a conversation. So Hiranyakashipu is saying, Kim, what is it? What has come now? The servant says, Simha, a lion has come. Kim, tatah Kim, and then what? And what then? Hiranyakashipu is asking. The servant says, Narasadrusha vapuhu. It's not just a lion. It has a body which resembles a human being. Narasadrusha vapuhu. Deva, O Lord. Chitram, oh, that's strange. Gruhito, has it been captured? So if there's a lion coming into the palace and with its body half human, have you even captured it? Hiranyakashipu asks his servants. Naivam, no, it hasn't been. Tat kotra, who is there? He's calling out for one of his servants. Jiva, one of the servants is saying, long live my lord. Drutam upanaya, bring it here at once. Upanayatam, Nanvayam Prapta Eva, he is already here. There's no question of capturing. See, you can also see in the conversation that there are only a few words which are spoken. It almost shows the urgency of the situation. The words that are spoken by Hiranyakashipu are really brief, and the answers given by his servants are also really brief. And that also is kind of, it goes well with the metrical pattern of the verse. And then we'll have to imagine that the Narasimha is approaching from a distance, and Hiranyakashipu says, Chapam, chapam, give me my bow, he asked. My bow, chapam, chapam, he says. And because it was at a distance, he wanted to shoot an arrow probably, but in no time, the Narasimha has even come closer to him. He says, Nakadgam, give me my sword. It is so close now. Tvarita taramaho. Quickly give it to me. He wants to kill that lion which is approaching. Karkashatvam nakanam ityam daityadi rajam nija naka kulishayir jagnivan yassa vovyat. So even before he could before Hiranyakashipu could lay his hands on his sword, he was torn apart by the lion, by the Narasimha. So the very verse captures dynamism, movement in the verse, and the anxiety of Hiranyakashipu and the Raudra of Narasimha. A very beautifully done verse. And we see that Hiranyakashipu is being taken onto the pedestal of his palace, and then there he is being torn apart. So in the calendar, we also describe the Natya Shastric elements which are present in the sculpture, the different hastas, the different moments of movement which are captured. So that one of such description here is here at the bottom. Then we have a couple of more. So this is a sculpture of Dakshinamurti. he is depicted usually under a Vatavruksha, Chitram Vatataror Mule, Vruddha Shishya Gururyava, Gurostu Maunam Vyakyanam, Shishyastu Chinna Samshayaha. This is from the Dakshinamurti Stotra of Shankaracharya. So Shiva sits facing the southern direction under the Vatavruksha. The Vatavruksha itself, with its aerial roots and multiplicity of trees, because of the aerial roots, that shows the infinite nature of knowledge. So Vatavruksha is not one tree; it's a tree complex, right? So the infinite nature of knowledge is kind of suggested by the Vatavruksha, and the very fact that Shiva is facing the southern direction, which is the direction of Yama, of the god of death, also shows that he has got the knowledge, he has got the Atma Jnana, because of which he captures death as well. He is Dakshinamurti, and he is Gurur Yuva. The teacher is very young at age. A person who is a Jivan Mukta, a person who has realized the self, an Atma Jnani, has this eternal knowledge of the Atman. So there is no question of aging for him. But his Shishyas, the students that who surround him, are really old. They have been striving to get the Atma Jnana. And Guru's to Maunam Vyakyanam. Dakshinamurti is also Maunamurti. The teacher is just silent. Through silence, the teacher communicates. And through silence, all the doubts of the students are removed. All the doubts of the student get dissolved. They vanish. Guru's to Maunam Vyakyanam. Shishyas to Chinna Samshayaha. The doubts of the students are removed. They vanish in no time. It's also interesting that here in this depiction, we have the deer which are intently listening to him. We have the lions or the tigers which are intently listening to him. And also the snake. You can see the depiction of snake there, which should have been the Naga Varanara across Shiva's neck. That also has come out from being entangled in his leg. And it also seems to be intently listening to him. Shiva also holds an Akshamala in his hand, which also shows the infinite nature of knowledge, the circular nature of knowledge, the cyclic nature of knowledge. Akshamala, which again means something which has no end. So this is Dakshinamurti. I'll take only a couple of minutes and finish off with the presentation. So we also had the Hoysala period depicted in one of the calendars, the year before last, in 2019. So we have very interesting sculptures from the Hoysala period, and Dr. D.V. Gundappa was one of the earliest persons to get inspired by the Hoysala sculptures, especially these Shalabanjikas, the Shilabalikas, and the bracket figures of the beautiful damsels which are in the Belur temple. He has composed this Antapura Gitas based on that. But here, in our endeavor, we mapped them onto poems from classical Sanskrit poetry. What instance this could represent potentially? So this is called Mukura Mugdha or Darpana Sundari, a lady who is looking at her own face with a mirror in her hand. So that we have mapped onto a verse from Kalidasa's Kumarasambhava. Darpane cha paribhoga darshini prushtata pranayino nishedushaha Prekshya bimba mano bimba matmadaha kani kanina chakara lajjaya. A very interesting one. So this is Parvati apparently. She is getting ready. She is decking up herself. She is putting on her makeup very discreetly so that she can impress Shiva with her looks. So while she is looking at herself in the mirror, very silently from behind, Shiva comes there and she looks at Shiva. She catches a glimpse of Shiva in reflection in her mirror. So she wanted a moment of privacy, but Shiva is kind of spying upon her. Kani na chakara lajjaya. It's what all did she not do because of her embarrassment, because of her shyness. So that's what this verse is saying. So again, a mapping on of a verse from Kumarasambhava, from one of the classical poems, to a sculpture from the Hoysala period. I'll finish off with this probably because I've almost run out of time. So this is famously called the Shukabhashini, but we have mapped this on to a verse from Amarushataka. the verse goes as follows. Dampatyor nishi jalpator gruhashuken akarnitam yadvachas tat pratar guru sannitau nigatataha tasyati matram vaduhu karnalambita padmaraga shakalam vinyasya chanchu pute vridartha vidadhati dadimapala vyajena vagbandhanam. So it's a very interesting episode captured by Amarashataka in this verse. So apparently it's probably a joint family where the husband and wife are never getting a moment of privacy. But that one particular night, they managed to be away from all the elders in the family and they got a private moment to spend with each other. So they had a very intimate conversation with each other, the husband and wife, a newly married couple probably. They oblivious to the presence of everyone else, or rather there was nobody else present there, thinking that there was nobody else present there. They had this very intimate conversation. Probably the wife could have complained about the mother-in-law or about the rest of the family members to the husband, or they could have had some other romantic conversation. But then they think that all is well, and in the morning, or both of them wake up and the husband probably goes outdoors for his work. But the lady, this girl, is really shocked when she hears that her pet parrot has listened to the conversation which they had the entire night and goes around the house announcing whatever they had spoken. So they probably had a romantic conversation, or probably the lady was sharing some of her agonies with her husband, or the husband was sharing some of his agonies with her. So now she's really shocked. We thought we have got absolute privacy, but there was this pet parrot which has listened to all of this and it is going around the house and announcing our conversation. So tat pratar guru sannito nigatataha. There were all these elderly people seated there, and this parrot is flying around the house and announcing about this. So she doesn't know what to do. She probably looks around for a seed of a pomegranate seed to put it between its beak. She does not get that probably. She has an earring which is decked with a ruby. She takes out that earring and keeps this ruby between the beak of the parrot, and that makes it vag bandhana, that shuts its mouth up. Vridartha vidadhati dadimapala vyajena. She cheats the bird by giving the impression that this little ruby is the dadimapala, the pomegranate seed, and that becomes the vagbandhana. It shuts its mouth. So again, an association of classical poetry to one of the available sculptures in the Hoysala period. So there are several more very interesting ones. And I also wanted to talk about narrative sculptures. So these are like independent sculptures, but there are these narrative panels where one after the other, like a comic book, there are stories told in sculptures, especially in the Hoysala temples, and also in the Prambanan temple in Indonesia, and also the Borobudur monument in Indonesia. We have several narrative sculptures. Probably I'll do it on another occasion. I have already run out of time. Yeah, with this, I'll conclude for the day. Thanks for the opportunity given. And if there are any questions, I'll take them. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much, sir. If you could stop the screen share.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure.
First of all, sir, that was a very, very fascinating lecture. I think we would love to have a part 2 of this, because there is so much more content. Because you say, I saw that you would yet to talk on sculptures of Ramayana, Mahabharata, and the narrative sculptures. If you're okay, it would be amazing to have one more lecture from your side, sir. I think when you started off with the the first sculpture of one of the first sculptures of Varaha, it reminded me of the Udaygiri, very similar sculpture. Right. You're aware of it in the Udaygiri caves, very, very huge.
Huge one, yes. Yes.
Very similar. When you spoke of the water, I remember seeing the striations and the Naga, and I think it precedes the...
Yes.
By at least 200-300 years.
Right.
So it's very beautiful. And then very fascinating was the Bhatrahari Vairagya Shatakas. It is very fascinating to see the depiction of Mahakala and Mahakali playing together. And the most fascinating part was the panel of Nandi. These rasas also seen on sculptures, Hasya, Shringara, Raudra, and Karuna. When you said that you see Karuna Rasa from Nandi and the Hasya Rasa from the Gana side. And it looks like the poem, either I don't know what was the time period of the poet. if the sculptor who sculpted it read the poetry and kept that in mind while depicting it, it is a new door altogether. It is absolutely beautiful. And you got in Chalukyas, they're all around contemporaries, or Chalukyas and Pallavas are constantly in fight with each other. These two.
Right. But creatively, they are the same. Although they are in a political warfare, artistically, they are united.
Absolutely. Chalukyas and Pallavas. And then you got Rashtrakutas, the Manya Kheta, who I think immediately after the Chalukyas, they came into picture. Really excited for more from the Hoysala sculptures also, because when you talk of the Puranas, I think, or the epics also, Ramayana and Mahabharata, I think we just cannot miss the Hoysala panels. Absolutely. I think we are now open for discussion, comments, and questions. If anybody has any questions, you could either raise your hands, switch on your videos, or type down your questions. We'll take a few questions.
Yeah, sure. I see. There's a question by Mr. Sundaram Ramachandran. Is the mapping between the sculpture and the verse present in classical texts, or is it a creative interpretation by the current authors? So here, what we see here is a creative interpretation. We are just aesthetically blending. We are just mapping them together. It's not that we have got some historical records which prove this fact, that this very sculpture was inspired by this very point. We have no such evidence. But what's definitely true, like I mentioned a couple of times already, is that these thoughts were present in the Indian civilization. It was like present in the community. So the artists who sculpted and the poets who wrote them, they had similar thought process. So they chose different media for their expression. But however, the Shastra Granthas, such as the Manasara and the Kamikagama, the Mayamata, etc., they actually specify that certain Puranic episodes need to be sculpted on the temple walls. But what Puranic episodes, it again depends on who the temple is dedicated to, who is the main deity of the temple, and how big the temple is, and what is the caliber of the sculptors, etc. But in general, to give an animated view of the epic tradition or the storytelling tradition of India, it was recommended, it has been recommended by the Shastras also, that sculptures will have to represent stories in a temple, in the temple complex. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
I'll probably request them to also read out the question. I think there'll be a direct interaction.
Right, sure.
I will probably, we have quite a few questions coming in.
Yeah. If anybody has another question.
Mr. Sunil Kumar, if he's here, I'll probably unmute him and. Yeah. Sir, I've unmuted you. Sunil Kumar, sir, you could ask your question. If he's here, otherwise. Okay.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we do.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, my question was, I'll just read it out. How prevalent were classical motifs in different parts of India? And what were the geographical variations across South India, rest of India, and different dynasties, as in you mentioned Hoysalas, etc. So even in Tamil Nadu, we had
the Cholas,
yeah. That was just a question.
Okay, very, very good question. Thanks a lot. So your question is like, were these classical works prevalent throughout India, and was it the same classical work prevalent, or did it have its own different versions, literary versions, or the oral traditions? Was there variance between the different versions of the stories that were heard around India? So yes, we find some kind of difference in the depiction. A difference in depiction in stone, and the difference in treatment of a particular topic by different poets across India. But philosophically, they are all the same. They take the same raw material, but then they use their creative minds for interpolating these stories. Again, when we talk about sculptures, we'll also have to keep in mind the medium through which, the stone medium. So if it's soapstone, then you have more potential for detailing. If it's granite, then you have lesser scope. is hard. And it also depends on the political stability which was present at that period of time, and the amount of material and human resource and money that the person who's sponsoring could invest on building a temple. And the poets who were around that period, the artists who were around that period, their thoughts, their interpretations would get reflected in the temple sculptures. Yes, there is definitely some amount of variance in the depiction of the same episode. For example, you have the Narasimha and Hiranyakashipu. We find it in the Hoysala sculptures. We find it in the Badami Chalukya sculptures. We find it in Cholas. We find it in the Pallavas. We also find it in the Kushana period, and also in the Kalingas of the Gajapatis of Orissa, etc. We find the theme, but again, the artists have taken creative liberty to bring out different features, to bring up their own taste. They bring in different flavors in their depiction. There is some amount of variance, but then that is an independent study in itself. I could recommend some reading material for people who are interested to see the development of the Narasimha motif with time, or the development of the Mahanata motif, like the dancing Shiva motif, which today we popularly call as Nataraja. This motif over time in temple sculptures and in poetry. So that's an independent study in itself. But philosophically, all these themes are united throughout India. But at the surface level, there is some amount of creative variance. I hope that has answered your question to some extent.
Thank you. Sir, we have a set of questions by Mr. Sunil Sunkara. I'm unmuting.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Namaste, Arjunji.
Oh, wonderful. Very good question. Well, to be honest, I have not come across sculptures which are depicting an episode of a Purana with a description below it. But however, like you are very well aware, Sunilji, the Karana sculptures, the non-representative sculptures, usually come with some kind of inscriptions, the movement sculptures. But Puranic sculptures, as far as my knowledge goes, as far as my limited exposure goes, have not come with any kind of inscription accompanying them. Trying to throw light on what it represents, etc. That's not there. And also from my reading of several different authors, whether it is Shivram Murthy or T.A. Gopinath Rao or Stella Kramrish, etc., none of them seem to have spoken about sculpture and the story that the sculpture represents being inscribed right below it. We'll also have to probably keep in mind that these stories were very much present in the Indian ethos, in the total consciousness of the Indians. So probably they did not need to have that inscription below there. Like today, when we go to museum, we'll have to put a panel below it saying that this is Bhuvaraha Murti, because we have got disconnected with the storytelling tradition of India, and we'll need some external assistance to relate to the sculpture. Probably the Indians of the past did not need that. Yeah, and also to inscribe something is again additional effort, and that also defeats the purpose of a sculpture probably. So sculpture is a kind of a pictorial representation of the story. So to understand the story, if you have to read a text below it, then that's kind of complicating the matter. So the sculptures are largely for everyone, but also more importantly for children and other people who cannot read texts. Probably that's one of the purposes which it would have served.
Thank you, sir. I'll request Amrita to read a question out. Amrita.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I felt like I was actually walking those places and hearing those verses. It will make a huge difference to actually have a tour of a temple like this. I mean, the ideas that come into a person's mind would really broaden. So I just had a general question.
Yes.
What would you say is the essential difference between an idol and a sculpture? Especially when you talked about Ugra Narasimha and the whether he's smiling or not. Is there a reason you don't see him smiling in an idol, but you can see him smiling in a sculpture, for example?
So by idol, do you mean the one which is worshipped in the Garbhagruha? Is that what?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Are there other forms? That's the one I'm most familiar with.
Yeah, so the idol or the Vigraha, which is worshipped within a Garbhagruha, That's also called the Moola Bera Vigraha. So there are certain set principles given for sculpting out a Moola Bera Vigraha, the one that needs to be enshrined in a Garbhagruha, that has certain principles. It should usually be a Saumya Devata, a positively, a smiling one or a soft one, a gentle Devata has to be kept in a Garbhagruha in general. But in certain parts of the city, you can have an Ugra Devata also. So the main idol or the Moola Bera Vigraha has certain principles. Again, it is rooted in human psychology, and you'll have to get some positive spirit when you go and look at the temple sculpture, which is within the Garbhagruha, the idol which is within the Garbhagruha. However, what comes around in the external part of the temple, there the artists could give creative liberty. So that's why you see that you have all these erotic, so-called erotic, today we perceive it as erotic sculptures, but then back then it was not so erotic probably. Yet again, the perception of whether something is erotic or not, what needs to have some kind of what should be depicted and what should not be depicted, that changes with time probably. But then you wouldn't have an erotic sculpture as the Moola Bera Vigraha, nor would you have a narrative sculpture as the Moola Bera Vigraha. So there are certain properties for Moola Bera Vigraha, and the rest of the sculptures, the artist can use his imagination, his creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Is there
sir.
anything? Yeah.
We will take a few more. We have our, okay. I think we'll take one last question from Sanjana before we wind up this current session. Sanjana, I'm unmuting you if you could read out your question.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation. It was really an enjoyable presentation. I just had one question because in one of the previous Kaavyaalaap sessions, we also had Dr. Gayatri Iyer bring in the kind of explore the intersections of sculpture, poetry, and dance. And one of the points that she brought out then was how there were a lot of sculptures in kind of that she found in her study, which were depicting the act of writing itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the act of composition. So I wonder if you found any in any kind of any such sculptures in your exploration or study, and when you found them, how did you kind of go about the process of mapping versus to those sculptures?
If I were to find a sculpture which actually shows the process of writing because
she was talking about sculptures in Khajuraho, and she was drawing upon, and she also had so that's my question.
So if I found a sculpture depicting a poet who's writing a poem, the sculpture itself depicts a poet who's writing a poem. So what poem would I map on to such a sculpture? Oh, well, there are multiple ones. In Sanskrit poetry, we have poems about poets who are writing poems. So it's not difficult at all. Like in the Mangala Shlokas of her Madhura Vijayam, Ganga Devi, writes so much about poets. Probably I would map it on to, say, a Leela Shuka writing poems about Krishna, or to, say, Kalidasa writing poems about Shiva and Parvati, or something like that. It's not a difficult thing at all.
What considerations would you take into account while kind of choosing which verse?
Okay. Well, it's only an aesthetic mapping, and neither me nor the entire team of Preksha, none of us are saying that this is the only verse which goes well with this. We are trying to see which verse, which is already available in literature, captures maximum features of the sculpture. Or the vice versa, which sculpture captures most of the features of the poem that we are presenting. That's what we are trying to do. The emotion has to be captured, essentially. So that's emotion is what is rasa, right?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. I think I'll just answer this last question, and we'll stop at that. Did the sculptors learn literature formally as a part of their training? They very much did. The Agamas and also the Shilpa Shastra Granthas, right behind me, have some of them. Yeah, they actually give the training that a sculptor would need to undergo. So they did have a very thorough reading of literature, and poets in turn had a very thorough understanding of the Natya Shastra, the Shilpa Shastra, etc. All of them went hand in hand. They were not like discrete subject. They were all united as one thing, and each one had to have knowledge of several other shastras and several other creative processes. Fine. We would stop with that
Thank
probably.
you so much. No, sir, we will open up our WhatsApp group for further questions for
Sure.
about an hour or so. So if there are any more queries or questions, you could please, we'll keep the chat space
Sure.
open for the viewers and the speaker to take the discussion further.
Okay.
And thank you so much, one and all. I would request Meera Kumar to give the formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Meera.
So yeah, thank you so much, Arun sir, for that wonderful lecture. I think we all thoroughly enjoyed it, and the very interesting discussion that followed is a testimony for that as well. So I would like to take this moment to thank Dr. Sangeeta Menon and Dr. Shankar Rajaraman also, who has conceptualized this event so beautifully, so that all the poets around the world can connect and have a good time and listen to scholars like you. So thanks to them, and thank you very much, sir, for giving your valuable time and resources, sharing it with us. And Preet for always being a coordinator of Kaavyaalaap, and Ashwini and Abhishek, also Niharika, who are coordinators with our team. So thank you everybody, and thank you all the wonderful audience who keep coming for Kaavyaalaap events and share the joy of poetry. So we hope to see you again soon. We will share the details of our next program to you as well. So thank you everybody, and have a good time.
Thanks a lot. Namaste everyone. Have a nice evening.